It is an occasion of pleasure for me. Pachaiyappa's college had provided two teachers, eminent teachers, who taught me international studies and European history when I was a student. Dr. T.R. Ramachandran and Narayanan, they were my teachers. So it is an occasion for me to rejoice the occasion. I thank the principal of Pachaiyappa's college and the postgraduate department of history headed by Dr. Saravanan for having given me this opportunity to share my views on certain aspects of Tamil Nadu history with the august gathering. Friends, you are all well-learned historians. I only want you to consider my concerns and views on the topic given by me as regionalizing the history of Tamils. I really appreciate when the history department headed by Saravanan chose the topic on the history of Tamil Nadu, because such occasion facilitate us to go into deeper aspects of Tamil history, the micro level and macro level aspects of Tamil history. We have much to do in it. Tamil Nadu history is still to be molded. Though the earliest history, Tamil 1800 years ago, was contributed by Kanakasabai in the beginning of the 20th century. And thereafter there were several works on Tamil history. Still, the task is incomplete. We have yet to provide a credible history of Tamil Nadu. That is one thing. But I was a little wondering why the organizer chose regional history of Tamil Nadu instead of history of Tamil Nadu. There is a vast difference between these two. History of Tamil Nadu we understand. Within Tamil Nadu, we trace our heritage from the remote past to the present. But when you put an adjective regional history, that gives a difference. Regional means you are not main. Regional makes you either secondary, supplementary, lesser tradition, or lesser significance. You don't make yourself a major historical identity. So I thought of going into this aspect. How to position Tamil Nadu as a region in a major factor. You know that why we call it a region? Because we have India as a nation. So in a larger concept, you identify India as a major historical identity. And you try to put Tamil Nadu as a region, a part of that nation. But very often, the regions, that definition region was used earlier for things that were lesser importance. There was a Greek empire culminated in the Alexandrian conquest. Even in the Greek empire, Macedonia was treated as a region. And the Roman Empire, all the non-Latin states, including Germany, France, Austria, and England, they were treated as regions. That is, they could not be treated on par with the main kingdom, Roman Empire. They were secondary, supplementary, or supportive. The Holy Roman Empire, the electoral states were the mainstay. The non-electoral units were regions, because the sovereignty of these non-electoral units was emphasized by the use of the word region or territory. The British Empire, when it existed for more than 200 years or 250 years, the British Empire considered India as an Asian region, Asian territory. Even the 13 colonies in the American continent were treated as regions, colonies. That meant they were not on equal footing with the headquarters which was fixed at London. So, a secondary or supplementary status were given to the regions. But those days were monarchical days, when the authority was vested with a hereditary authority and people have no choice in the administration except express their pleasure, displeasure occasionally in different ways. But the situation is different now. Are we in a monarchical state? We are not in a monarchical order. We are in a democratic order. And the India, which you imply as the nation and Tamil Nadu as a region, in a way it can be compared with Europe. Though R. Satyanatha Iyer, the learned historian, who once compared India geographically with Italy, also being compared with the Himalayas and the Po River compared with this the Narmada. But politically and culturally speaking, India could be compared only with the European continent. Today you have got a federated European Union where different languages are spoken, different cultures flourish. There were Catholic states, different categories of Catholic states, different categories of non-Catholic states. But they formed a federal government. And that the history of Europe, when it is written, no territory is treated as supplementary, subordinated to the main. You go through any history, from the or the Hayes and Moon and all these famous historians, when they wrote Europe in history, they gave equal importance to all regions. Only by collating the different regions, they could form a Europe. And the British Empire too, when it was the helm of, it was in its brightest days, they did not treat even the English-speaking Americans as equals. Now the days are different. The Indian historiography commenced in the colonial days. Writings on Indian history commenced in the days of the colonial regime. William Jones and others took the initiative, and James Mill produced the first history on British India in 1817 for a different purpose, but that marked the beginning of Indian history. Indian history was the product of Indological studies, but it had a wrong beginning, because at that time the British Empire functioned from Calcutta, Bengal. There were three major provinces under the Governor General: Calcutta, Madras and Bombay. While composing history of India, they totally ignored the other two provinces. Those who wrote history at that time, they relied upon sources from those people who were subserving them. They were assisting them in the administration in Bengal. So they mostly depended on Sanskrit and Persian sources for writing ancient medieval history. Either they were ignorant of other things at that time, or there were constraints for them to consider those sources too. So there was a total neglect of the entire South India, the Progrithic sources and the Dravidian sources. So with only sources available at Bengal from a group which was socially different, they created history of India. So that history of India, which continued to dominate the administrative level for nearly 7 decades, that history of India was nothing but the history of northern India. It was also a regional history, northern region. But they wanted us to consider it as national history. Rigvedic culture, when you go through it, the earliest writings on Indian history commenced with the Vedic age. Rigvedic society was confined to Punjab and to certain extent to a part of Afghanistan. Technically speaking, it was a regional history of the Indus region. But you treated it as reflecting the Indian culture. The later Vedic period was concentrating mostly on the Gangetic region. Yet, it is given in our history books that reflected Indian culture. So, histories on India were mostly a biased one. The northern regions were given, Sanskrit sources were the only sources considered, and a particular tradition alone was considered as the Indian tradition. What is very disturbing is that even the learned scholar K.A. Nilakanta Shastri considered Sanskrit tradition as greater tradition and all other traditions as lesser traditions. So this is a very, a disturbing trend that we witnessed during the early days. But what happened? Even after the capital was shifted from Calcutta to Delhi, the trend in Indian historiography did not change. The only important development was that the central India was given more importance, or Delhi and surrounding regions were given more importance. So that is a very disturbing one. How do we position Tamil Nadu in the national history, a federal history? The history written earlier was a unitary history of India which had nothing to do with the plural reality of India. For a plural India, a unitary history was provided. That was a faulty one. That may create so many problems too, because a proper understanding of history was necessary to create a brighter democratic system in our country. The writings mostly dwarfed or eclipsed the entire South. Only after 1836, after James Princer deciphered the Brahmi script, Buddhist India came to light. And the later archaeological discoveries made it clear that for nearly 1,000 years, North India witnessed a culture which was mostly guided by Buddhist Sangha and Buddhist principles. From Mauryas to Harsha, most of the architecture belonged to the Buddhist school. Most of the literature belonged to the Buddhist school. So this was made possible after the deciphering the Brahmi script. But even then, the South continued to be neglected. by the historians. Even today, when you go through the history books written for the undergraduate students or postgraduate students in other universities, especially North Indian universities, you will find scant reference to South India. They treat only a particular tradition, a trend, a Gangetic trend or Gangetic tradition as reflecting the Indian tradition or the Hindu tradition. This is erroneous. This has to be corrected. So when we debate on regional history of Tamil Nadu, we will have to make ourselves sure that by considering ourselves a region, we need not allow ourselves to be pushed to the peripherals of Indian nation. We are something more. We are a contributor, major contributor to India's past. And we are contributing even in the contemporary period a lot. So regions cannot be made insignificant. They cannot be simply set aside for the sake of projecting one particular trend as the national trend. A nation is built in this subcontinent only by combining the various traditions, not by ejecting the major sources. For the sake of clarity, I will mention a few things. The Mauryan Empire lasted for 138 years. The Guptan Empire lasted for nearly 150 years. The Mauryan Empire, of course, covered a larger area. Even a part of peninsular India were under their authority. But this Guptan Empire, the so-called Guptan Empire, in spite of the eulogistic reference in the Allahabad pillar inscription, it was confined mostly to the Gangetic region. It had no direct authority over the South Indian regions. Though Harisena claims that Samudragupta conducted Digvijaya in the south, Dakshina Digvijaya, and defeated a number of South Indian rulers but restored them their kingdoms. There is no corroboratory evidence. But still it is accepted an historical fact in Indian history books. Similar claims were made by Rajaraja Rajendra in South India, Gangai Kondan, Kalingam Kondan. So there were Tamil kings who made claims in the inscriptions and the literature that they conducted military expeditions to the Gangetic region and won victories. But such references are not included in the national history. If you can trust one single reference in the Allahabad pillar inscription to glorify the Guptan Empire, why can't you give the same treatment to the claims made by the Tamil rulers? In fact, the Chola Empire, which made similar claims, lasted for nearly 4 centuries. They had a longer duration. Even the South India, there was a Sadavahana kingdom, empire. In the heydays of Sadavahanas, the Sadavahana Empire covered a larger area. Almost the entire Deccan was under their control, up to the borders of Tamil Nadu. And even Malwa, to the north of India, were under their control. In addition, they conducted a few raids into other Gangetic areas. The Sadavahanas continued to rule Deccan for more than 450 years, and they controlled larger areas in the peninsular India than the Guptas in North India. But how do the histories treat them? A passing reference to Sadavahanas. And there is no reference to the Chalukyas, Rashtrakutas, the Rashtrakutas, Krishna and Dhruva and others. their expedition reached as far as Kannauj. But you are not giving them an all India recognition. They don't come in the glory of India. How is that? And you simply don't refer to Hoysalas. The Hoysalas, they contributed much to the architecture. They had territories in two linguistic regions, Kannada region and Tamil Nadu region. And they resisted the Bahmani sultans for a longer time, or the Alauddin Khilji for a longer time. And those people are not given appropriate or adequate space in the writings of Indian history, because you treat them as regions. Anything in the south is a region, not a nation. A nation should give equal attention to all the regions which come under this nation. But history cannot be used for a unitary interest. In a federal India, history should reflect the federalism in its writings. So that is one thing. Perhaps this was due to the wrong beginnings. It began in Calcutta, later shifted to Delhi. But the colonial regime started not in the north earlier. The first English headquarters was built only at Chennai, Madras, St. George Fort. That is about 80 years before Bombay and Calcutta emerged as major centers. The first the colonial government was established only in Chennai, St. George Fort. Had the historiography of India commenced in Madras, perhaps the nature of Indian history written by the British scholars would have been different.
உன் கடவுளை விட, உன் சாஸ்திரத்தை விட, உன் முன்னோரை விட, உன் வெங்காயம் வழக்கமாத்தை விட, உன் அறிவு பெருசு, அதை சிந்தி.